Hello, my name is Ref Tom Green, or at least that's the name I'm best known at board game conventions from my roller derby days. And today I'm here to talk to you about It's a Train Wreck, which is a co-op real-time puzzle game that plays in about 10 minutes, plays best from 2 to 6 players, at least with the prototype pieces and the number of components that you see here in front of you. And this video is really directed mostly at publishers because that's what I'm looking for. I do not particularly want to kickstart this myself. There are cities, which include a train yard. There are these cubes, which essentially represent boxcars and other goods that are being delivered to cities. The color designates the city it's going to be delivered to. There are pegs, which represent the crew. The colors tie back to the cities themselves. There are obstacles, which can be included or not depending on individual scenarios. There are bridges that the trains pass through from one player to another. And there are also tunnels that trains can pass through from one player to the other during the game. And while the prototype uses this little timer, presumably in a production version this would be replaced by a app that would include maybe train sound effects. And then there are these little arrows that are used to point to adjacent cities. You can put this little arrow during the game that would remind the player. The trains themselves come in 2 different sizes, small and large, and these correspond to different size spaces in the train yards in the cities. While the large train can fit in only the large space, the small train during the game can fit in the small or large size space, and this is part of the puzzle. During the game, a player will control 1 or more cities, and by that I mean they will be allowed to manipulate the trains at particular cities. Now, the color is not indicative of anything other than to indicate which cargo goes to what cities. So in this case, we have the yellow city, yellow crew pegs, and in this configuration, there's an orange city off to this direction, a blue city off to this direction, and we would start the game during setup by putting 4 of each color cube that doesn't match the city that they're leaving from. And so I've kind of replicated this, but basically, at the beginning, once you had the counts, you would scramble them up and then push them into a line, which I've already done. And then during the game, the player can only choose from the ends. And so the timer starts and the player begins stacking the cubes into the trains in whichever configuration makes sense. So again, the player is putting these cubes onto the train and they can't pick from the center. In order for a train to move to another city, you have to add crew. That's just putting the peg here. And the trains do not have to be completely loaded before they leave. So once a crew has been added, the train can be lifted only by the player who controls that city and then handed to another player. When a train arrives in the city, they place it down, and then the player, if there were any matching cubes for that color, would remove them and put them just here to indicate that they've been arrived. So we're going to be sending every other color out, and as the trains with yellow cubes arrive and are placed here, the player who controls the yellow city will take the yellow cubes and set them here. And then at the end of the game, scoring is done by multiplying the number of cubes that have arrived at the 2 fewest numbered cities. In other words, and you have a target number that you're trying to get. Like in a recommended for a 2-player game, you're trying to score at least 100 points. So you need at least the 2 lowest city deliveries have to be maybe like 10 and 10. That'd be 100. There are minuses for doing things like dropping cubes like this, or dropping the entire train. And I won't go into all of the scoring details for this overview, but there would be penalty points subtracted from your overall score. Also, you can't deliver cubes to the wrong color city. Now, there is another bit of the puzzle, which is the crew itself can only operate in a train to the next two adjacent cities. And that's probably the biggest part of the puzzle of the game, is that while individual trains may go from one end of the country to the other, the crew is only operating within a restricted area of its home city and any adjacent city. Now let's look at an example of one of many, many different configurations that are possible with this game. This is normally what I set up when I'm doing demos for a two-player game. All 6 cities are used. Now I added the black construction paper just in this first view so that it's clear how the different cities are connected to one another. So the yellow city is essentially at one end, the orange city as the other, and all trains as they move from city to city delivering goods will have to follow this course: yellow, blue, white, brown, green to orange. When the cities pass between the white and the brown cities, I'm using the bridge component in this particular scenario, and we have the 2 tunnels on the end. So any train that passes between the blue and the yellow city must pass through this tunnel. It's important to point out that there are more cubes that begin the game at each of the cities than one would expect to be able to deliver within whatever time it's setting. In the typical 2-player game, the time will start at 10 minutes and count down, and then at the end of 10 minutes the game is scored. Again, the players are trying to get shooting for a score of 100 points. So they would count how many yellow cubes have been delivered here. Notice that the yellow city starts with no yellow cubes, but by way of example, and the furthest traveling would be the yellow cubes from the orange city going all the way along this route before they arrive and are delivered here. So at the end of the game, we would look at the number of delivered cubes at each location, take the 2 lowest numbers, multiply those together. If it was, for instance, 20, 20, 20, 10, 10, and 20, we would still just look at the lowest 2 numbers and multiply 10 times 10 to get 100 points, which is the number we were trying for. Then you subtract for things like the dropped trains, dropped cubes, etc. Okay, so let's hit some of the highlights then for what makes this a puzzle game. When I'm looking as a player sitting on this board, I control these 2 cities, and I will not require the participation of my fellow player to coordinate moving cargo between these 2 cities. So let's just, by way of example, say that, well, this isn't a great move. Let's say I have these 2 brown cubes, and I can lift these up, swap these, the big train fits in the big train swap, the brown has arrived at the brown city, and I can deliver these, and this is towards scoring. Now, the color, when this green crew arrives here, while not a requirement, it's highly recommended in the rules as a suggestion to take that crew, because they've gone as far as they can, having left the green city, is to put it on the arrow with the color pointing back. So at some time when I have a train that needs to go that direction, as opposed to this direction, a good choice would be the green crew. He's worthless to me at this point. He's gone as far as he can this way. Likewise, I can take the brown crew, put it here. But in order for me to get anything to the yellow city, I'm going to have to work with my partner. So you have to talk during the game at all times and coordinate, and usually it goes something like this. Hey, I need to trade a big train headed this direction. Obviously, if I'm here, since I want to put only white, blue, and yellow cargo going that direction and green and orange going this direction from the brown city, the terminal cities, in this case the orange and yellow, well, all of these cubes are going that way, so I don't have to really sort them. So when you're using the bridge, the engine has to go through engine first. You give it a little push, the other player then picks up that train. Presumably they've made room for it. Usually they were going to have sent, there would be crew here, sent another train back with cargo going this direction. And if there's white cubes, they'd be delivered. If they're brown cubes, they'd be delivered here. You can rearrange these cities in not an infinite number of ways, but many, many different ways. The main variables are how many players, how many cities they're going to control, They're controlling 3 each in this scenario, but you could play with 6 players and have this exact same configuration, maybe spread it out a little bit more, and you'd have 3 players on that side of the table, 3 on this. If you move this down to the end of the table, you could have 1 player controlling these 2 cities, 1 player controlling these 2 cities, and 1 player controlling these 2 cities. And if the players find the game is too hard for 10 minutes, they can give themselves more time. Or if you're playing with younger children, they can give them more time. If players aren't interested in the dexterity component, they can be removed and you can still have the same puzzle of delivering as many cubes within the constraints of the time that you've set. So I've been very satisfied with the feedback I've got in this game that's been in development now for over 2 years, and I believe it's ready to be published. Thank you for your time.